The Aegean lay still, a mirror of divine wrath. Not a ripple disturbed its glassy surface. Not a whisper of wind stirred the sails of the 1,000 ships gathered at Aulis. For days, then weeks, the might of Greece, mustered for war, had festered in the oppressive calm, their bronze-clad hopes curdling into despair. The air hung thick with the stench of unwashed men, stale rations, and the growing dread of a campaign doomed before it began. You can almost feel the sweat on your skin, the frustration gnawing at your gut, the mounting desperation that would soon drive men to unthinkable acts. This was the prelude to the Trojan War, a conflict born of lust and pride, destined to consume generations and forever alter the course of ancient myth. But before Achilles could earn his glory, before Hector could fall, before Troy's walls could be breached by cunning, an even older, more primal horror had to be unleashed. A horror whose depths, even in the annals of a brutal age, remain largely unsung in their true, visceral dimension. We speak of Iphigenia, the eldest daughter of Agamemnon, the High King, whose name would become synonymous not merely with sacrifice, but with a profound, searing betrayal that ripped the heart out of a family and stained the very earth of Aulis crimson. Her story is often sanitized, presented as a noble, perhaps tragic, necessity. But strip away the veneer of poetic verse and the comforting distance of millennia, and you confront a raw, psychological and physical torment far more brutal than you can comprehend. Imagine the scene. The greatest warriors of Greece, Odysseus, Menelaus, Nestor, the legendary Achilles, all trapped, impatient, their ambitions stalled by an invisible hand. The prophet Calchas, whose pronouncements carried the weight of the gods themselves, delivered the chilling truth. The goddess Artemis, enraged by Agamemnon's boastful hunting prowess, or perhaps by the killing of one of her sacred stags in her hallowed grove, had tethered the winds. Only a sacrifice of unparalleled purity, a maiden of royal blood, would appease her. Agamemnon's own daughter, Iphigenia. Consider, for a moment, the agony of Agamemnon. The king, trapped between the demands of a furious goddess and the desperate will of his army, and the fundamental biological imperative to protect his child. His internal struggle, as depicted in the ancient texts, is a maelstrom of fear, ambition, and paternal love. He paces, he rages, he debates with his brother Menelaus, but the pressure from 1,000 idle ships, from 10,000 restless, starving men, from the relentless, chilling logic of a fate-bound world, was an inexorable force. The collective will of an army, starved for glory and frustrated by divine intervention, is a powerful, terrifying entity. The solution, proposed by the cunning Odysseus, was a monstrous lie. Iphigenia would be summoned to Aulis not for sacrifice, but for marriage. To whom? To Achilles, the greatest warrior of their age, a hero whose very name was synonymous with invincibility. For a young princess, this would have been a dream, a glorious destiny. And so, the trap was set. Think of Iphigenia then, in her ancestral home, Mycenae, a girl, perhaps 13 or 14, on the cusp of womanhood. She would have been innocent, sheltered, accustomed to the grandeur of her father's palace. Her days likely filled with the mundane rhythms of noble life, embroidery, music lessons, perhaps tending to the family's sacred duties, listening to tales of gods and heroes. Then comes the summons, disguised as a joyous decree. The High King, her father, has arranged a magnificent marriage for her to the legendary Achilles. The honor, the excitement would have been overwhelming. Imagine her anticipation during the journey from Mycenae to Aulis. The dust of the road, the rhythmic clang of the chariot wheels, the unfamiliar coastal breeze carrying the scent of salt and pines. Her mother, Clytemnestra, a formidable queen in her own right, accompanies her, undoubtedly beaming with maternal pride. They would have spoken of the grandeur of the wedding, the renown of Achilles, the future that awaited Iphigenia as the bride of such a hero. Every mile brought her closer not to a wedding bed, but to an altar. Not to a future, but to a chilling, desolate end. The moment of revelation, according to Euripides' haunting play, Iphigenia in Aulis, is a gut-wrenching descent into psychological terror. Upon arriving, At the camp, instead of wedding preparations, Iphigenia and Clytemnestra are met with a chilling silence, the furtive glances of soldiers, and a sense of unease that thickens the air. Clytemnestra soon learns the truth from a sympathetic old servant. Agamemnon's true purpose in summoning their daughter. The shock would have been devastating. A mother's protective fury erupts, confronting her husband, tearing at his self-serving justifications. But it is Iphigenia's reaction that truly plunges us into the depths of this horror. Imagine her, the innocent child, standing there as her parents engage in a desperate shouting match. The words sacrifice, Artemis, blood, altar would have pierced her ears, shattering the illusion of her glorious future. The sudden, brutal shift from bridal adornments to sacrificial robes, from wedding hymns to the drone of priestly incantations, the vibrant tapestry of her life instantly unraveled, revealing a grim, blood-soaked thread. Her initial reaction would be, quite naturally, one of overwhelming terror. Euripides paints a devastating picture of her pleas. She would cling to her father, begging, weeping, reminding him of her childhood, of the simple joys they shared. She would invoke family, kinship, the sanctity of life itself. Her words, poignant and desperate, cut through the justifications of duty and divine will. "Father," she might have whispered, or screamed, her voice choked with tears. "Remember the day I sat on your knee and we played? Remember my birth, the joy you felt? How can you, who gave me life, now consign me to death? What wrong have I done? What sin have I committed that demands such a price?" But Agamemnon, though visibly tormented, was bound by a terrible iron grip. The fate of the expedition, the demands of the gods, the relentless pressure of his assembled army. He would turn away, his face a mask of anguish, his gaze unable to meet hers. This is not just a physical act of violence. It is a profound act of parental abandonment, a psychological rupture that would tear at the very foundations of her being. The realization that the person meant to protect you above all others is now your executioner that is a terror few can comprehend. For a moment, Achilles, enraged by the deception and his unwitting complicity, steps forward, offering to defend her. He is a warrior of immense power, but even he cannot defy the will of the entire Greek army, nor the chilling pronouncements of the gods. The troops, desperate for favorable winds, clamor for the sacrifice. Their cries for war, for Troy, for an end to the frustrating calm, drown out any last vestiges of mercy. Then, something shifts within Iphigenia. Faced with the futility of her pleas, the unwavering resolve of her father to see his ambition realized, and the bloodthirsty cries of the army, a chilling transformation occurs. In Euripides' version, she decides to embrace her fate, to walk willingly to her death as a savior of Greece. This is often interpreted as an act of noble patriotism, a young woman finding courage in the face of inevitable doom. But consider the psychological cost of such a decision. This willingness is not true agency. It is the grim, desperate acceptance of the utterly powerless. It is a coping mechanism, a final assertion of dignity in the face of absolute dehumanization. When all hope is stripped away, when your pleas fall on deaf ears, when your very father becomes your executioner, what else is left but to embrace the inevitable and attempt to frame it as a choice? It's a chilling form of psychological self-preservation, a last-ditch effort to reclaim some semblance of control over one's own ending. To walk with head held high when your legs are trembling, to offer your throat when every fiber of your being screams to flee. That is a form of terror almost more profound than a simple, desperate struggle. Now, let us turn to the ritual itself. Ancient Greek sacrificial rituals were not mere ceremonial acts. They were visceral, sensory experiences designed to awe, to bind, and to appease. When an animal was sacrificed, it was a brutal, bloody affair. For a human, the horror would be magnified 1,000-fold. Imagine the procession. Iphigenia, perhaps clad in a pristine white chiton, the traditional garment for sacrifice. Her hair, which should have been adorned with wedding garlands, is likely unbound, or perhaps bound in a symbolic way for the ritual. She walks, not led gently, but escorted, perhaps even restrained by priests or soldiers. The atmosphere would have been thick with the murmur of the crowd, the low chant of the priests, the clinking of bronze armor. Every step takes her closer to the makeshift altar, likely a rough-hewn stone or pile of earth, situated perhaps on the edge of the camp, overlooking the motionless, impatient ships. The air would be heavy with the scent of fear, not just Iphigenia's fear, but the collective anxiety of the assembled Greeks, their desperation for the winds to blow. Mixed with this, the acrid smell of burnt offerings from previous, failed sacrifices. Perhaps the metallic tang of dried blood from animals slaughtered for sustenance. And soon, the fresh, horrifying smell of human fear. The altar itself, picture it. Simple, stark, but imbued with immense symbolic power. Near it, the implements of sacrifice, basins for libations, perhaps a basket containing barley groats for purification, and the glinting bronze sacrificial knife. This knife, not merely a tool, but an instrument of divine will, sharpened to a lethal edge. Iphigenia is brought to the altar. Her feet, perhaps bare, would feel the rough ground, the chill of the morning air. Her eyes, wide with a mixture of terror and a forced stoicism, would scan the faces of the assembled army. She might catch her father's eye for a fleeting, agonizing second, a look of profound sorrow, or perhaps evasion. Her mother, Clytemnestra, would likely have been kept away, or forced to watch from a distance, her screams perhaps already echoing in the background. The ropes. This is a detail often overlooked but crucial to the physicality of the sacrifice. While Iphigenia might have walked willingly, a physical restraint would have been a standard part of such a ritual, ensuring the victim remained still. Imagine the rough fibers biting into her wrists, her ankles. The feeling of being bound, rendered utterly helpless, even if she offered no resistance. The loss of control, the total surrender of her physical being to the will of others, to the knife. The priest's approach. Calchas the prophet would preside. His voice, once delivering the chilling prophecy, now commands the ritual. The murmurs of the crowd would hush, replaced by the solemn intonations of the priests, invoking Artemis, pleading for her favor. The sound would be unnerving, a low drone, building to a crescendo. Then, the libation, wine or water poured onto the altar, perhaps on Iphigenia's head, a final ritual purification. The coolness of the liquid on her skin, a brief, stark contrast to the burning dread in her stomach. And then, the moment. The silence would become absolute, broken only by the rhythmic chanting, or perhaps the beating of a drum. The priest raises the knife. Imagine Iphigenia's perspective, the gleaming blade poised against the sky, reflecting the morning sun, her breath catching in her throat. The metallic scent growing stronger, mingled with the earthy smell of the altar, the sweat of the men around her. Her heart would be pounding, a frantic drum against her ribs. Her blood, rushing through her veins, would feel cold, then hot. Her muscles would tense, a primal instinct to flee, to fight, struggling against the ropes, against the crushing weight of fate. Even if she had embraced her role, her body would still betray her, reacting with the inherent terror of life facing its own termination. The pressure of the knife, cold and sharp, against her skin. The sensation of the edge, the moment of anticipation, stretched to an agonizing eternity. The collective gasp of the army, a shared intake of breath as the blade begins its descent. Some accounts speak of a blinding flash, a sudden mist, and the miraculous appearance of a hind in Iphigenia's place, whisked away by Artemis to Taurus. This is the version that offers solace, that softens the brutal reality. But even if such a substitution occurred, the intent was clear, the psychological torment already inflicted. Iphigenia lived through the horror of her own execution, felt the ropes, saw the blade, endured the cold terror of impending death. The intervention, if it happened, was at the very last possible second, leaving an indelible scar of trauma. Other, more grim accounts or interpretations of the surviving fragments leave the substitution ambiguous or omit it entirely, suggesting a full, brutal sacrifice occurred. In these versions, the sound of the blade severing flesh, the spurt of blood, the sudden, terrible silence that follows the life leaving a body. The warmth of her blood, steaming in the cool morning air, pooling on the altar, staining the white chiton. The collapse of her young body, a stark, lifeless contrast to the vibrant maiden she had been moments before. The silence after such an act would be profound, chilling. Then perhaps the first tentative rustle of a breeze, a stirring of leaves, a whisper on the water, and then the gradual swelling roar of the wind. The sails, which had hung limp and useless for so long, would snap taut. The ships, once rooted to the earth, would begin to shift, to creak, to surge against their moorings. The gods had been appeased. The sacrifice had worked. But at what cost? The winds that propelled the ships to Troy were metaphorically and perhaps literally stained with Iphigenia's blood. The glory of Troy was built upon a foundation of unspeakable family horror. Let us explore the ripple effects, the deeper psychological consequences that far outlasted the single brutal act. For Agamemnon, the sacrifice of his daughter was an indelible stain on his soul. It was the ultimate Faustian bargain, the salvation of his reputation and his army in exchange for the life of his child. This act would haunt him. While he may have rationalized it as a necessity, a king's duty, the weight of such a decision, the memory of her pleas, her tears, her final, chilling acceptance, would surely have burrowed deep into his psyche. He might have been a victorious king, but he was a broken father. The trauma would manifest not just in personal guilt, but in a subtle dehumanization, making him capable of greater cruelty, more ruthless decisions, a king increasingly detached from the human cost of his ambitions. He might have suppressed the memory, but it would fester, a silent cancer. For Clytemnestra, the psychological impact was catastrophic. It was not merely grief, but a searing, unquenchable rage. Her daughter had been lured under false pretenses and brutally murdered by her own father. This was the ultimate betrayal of a mother's trust, a wife's bond. Clytemnestra's fury would define her character for the rest of her life, turning her into an instrument of vengeance. Her love for Agamemnon would transmute into a corrosive hatred, plotting his downfall for years. She would live with the vivid, horrifying image of her daughter's sacrifice, playing it back in her mind, fueling her every vengeful thought. The act of Aulis was not just Iphigenia's end. It was the beginning of Clytemnestra's transformation into a formidable and terrifying avenger. For the Greek army, the event was a bonding ritual, a shared trauma that solidified their commitment to the war. They had witnessed a king sacrifice his own flesh and blood for their collective cause. This wasn't merely a display of power, it was a testament to the absolute, unyielding demand of their mission. It instilled a sense of grim determination, a belief that their suffering was justified by the magnitude of the initial sacrifice. But even for them, there would be residual unease, a chilling reminder of the raw, brutal power of the gods and the lengths to which men would go for glory. They had seen human sacrifice, not in some distant, barbaric land, but within their own ranks, at the hands of their own king. This act, while perhaps celebrated in the moment of its efficacy, would leave a collective shadow. The myth of Iphigenia's sacrifice is more than just a tragic tale. It is a profound exploration of human nature under extreme duress, the dark side of ambition, and the terrifying power of collective belief. It forces us to confront uncomfortable questions. What is the true cost of war? What happens when divine will clashes with human morality? And what horrors are men capable of inflicting, even upon their own kin, when faced with an impossible choice and overwhelming pressure? Consider the medical and psychological aspects, even through the lens of antiquity. The fear Iphigenia experienced would have triggered an extreme physiological response. Adrenaline surging, heart rate skyrocketing, pupils dilating, breath coming in ragged gasps. Her body would be screaming in primal terror, even as her mind sought to impose a fragile stoicism. The feeling of the ropes, the cold blade, the visual horror of the setup these sensory inputs would be overwhelming. If she were to be held down, the struggle, even if brief, would be desperate, animalistic. The sheer physical effort against restraint, the tearing of muscles, the desperation to breathe freely. Then, the sudden, brutal cessation of life, The rapid loss of blood, the immediate oxygen deprivation to the brain, the body's involuntary twitching, muscle spasms, the eerie moments of residual neurological activity that can occur after decapitation or massive trauma. Witnessing such an event would leave indelible images in the minds of the observers, images that would resurface in nightmares, in the quiet moments of reflection. The idea of divine intervention, the hind replacing Iphigenia, offers a glimmer of hope, a mitigation of the horror. But even in the version where Artemis truly intervenes and spirits Iphigenia away to Taurus, the psychological trauma on the girl herself would be immense. To face death, to be moments from the blade, to then be snatched away and placed in a strange foreign land, serving a goddess who almost sacrificed her, would be a profound psychological wound. She would live with survivor's guilt, with the vivid memory of her near death, with the knowledge that her own father had condemned her. Her identity would be forever shaped by that moment on the altar. The legend of Iphigenia, then, is a crucible for exploring themes of human sacrifice, not just as a historical or mythical practice, but as a psychological phenomenon. It speaks to the brutal realities of ancient life, where the gods were not distant metaphors but tangible forces, and their wrath could be appeased only through acts of extreme devotion, however horrifying. It was a world where human life, particularly that of a female, a child, could be deemed expendable for a greater, often male-defined, cause. It underscores the dehumanizing aspect of war and ambition. Iphigenia ceases to be a person. She becomes an object, a pawn, a tool to achieve a military objective. Her individuality, her hopes, her fears, are subsumed by the grander narrative of the Trojan War. This dehumanization is the first step towards justifying any atrocity. If a king can sacrifice his own child, what limits remain on the horrors he can inflict on his enemies? The story is a foundational trauma for the entire house of Atreus, a curse perpetuated from generation to generation. The murder of Iphigenia fuels Clytemnestra's revenge, leading to the murder of Agamemnon. This in turn provokes the matricide by Orestes, Iphigenia's brother, who is then pursued by the Furies. The cycle of violence, betrayal, and bloodshed, which had its roots in the cursed lineage of Tantalus and Pelops, found its most agonizing expression in the windswept plains of Aulis. What contemporary accounts, or rather the ancient dramatic retellings, often sanitize or elevate into noble tragedy, is the visceral, horrifying reality of a young life violently extinguished or nearly extinguished for political and military expediency. They highlight the king's dilemma, the divine mandate, the eventual success of the mission, but they often gloss over the raw terror, the desperate pleas, the physical struggle, the bitter taste of betrayal in a young girl's mouth as she confronted her own oblivion, the sheer scale of the assembled Greek fleet, the desperate ambition of its leaders, and the unyielding belief in divine causality converged to create a monstrous necessity. Iphigenia was not just a victim. She was a symbol of the brutal exigencies of ancient warfare, where human life was often cheap, and the line between necessity and atrocity was blurred by the demands of gods and glory. Her story is a chilling reminder that the foundations of epic tales are often built on the very real, very human suffering of those who were deemed expendable. So, the next time you hear of Iphigenia's sacrifice, do not merely envision a noble, self-sacrificing maiden. See her as a terrified girl, betrayed by her father, facing a sharpened blade. Hear her desperate pleas, feel the cold bite of the ropes, smell the fear and the blood. Understand the profound psychological trauma inflicted upon her, and the lasting, corrosive impact it had on an entire lineage. For in that brutal, unsung moment at Aulis, the true cost of ancient glory was paid, not in gold or land, but in the innocent blood of a child, a price far more brutal than you can comprehend.